This podcast is coming to you from Wongal and Gadigal country, also known as Balmain, where the Edmund Rice Centre for Justice and Community Education is located. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the country we share and agree that sovereignty was never ceded. Welcome to another episode of A JustER Generation. We have today a really very special guest, the former President of Kiribati, the Honourable Anote Tong, who is here visiting with the Australia Institute and took a bit of time out on his very hectic schedule to spend a bit of time with the Edmund Rice Centre to give a webinar, but also this interview. So thank you, Anote. Welcome to A JustER Generation.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be able to join you on this occasion. I have had a long association with the Edmund Rice Centre, and so once again, I'm happy to be able to join you here.
Anote, you have been an important voice for the climate justice and advocacy and climate change generally and internationally in terms of raising awareness for many years. But you're also President of Kiribati from 2003 to 2016. For those of our listeners not as familiar with your backstory, would you mind sharing what took you down the track of political life as an advocate for climate justice in the Pacific, your ongoing role as a member of the Pacific Elders Voice, and whatever other roles you're currently doing at the moment?
That's going back some years, Alopi, but let me say that, getting drafted into politics was really the last thing on my mind. I never, ever believed that I would make such a silly decision as to become a politician. But I think I believe in destiny. Maybe it had always been my destiny to go in that path. But on joining politics in 2003, I've never looked back really, and I think I've enjoyed the challenges. And I'm sure, like all aspiring politicians, you think you can change the world. But I came to the practical realization that things do take time. And of course, when I came into office as president in 2003, it was at the time that international tourism was dominating the international agenda. And so as I was going to the United Nations General Assembly in 2004, I was wondering, what do I speak about? But in the process, I had been reading the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And of course, I saw these words on one of the reports: sea level rise. Given our very vulnerable geography, barely very narrow strips of islands on top of seamounts, Kiribati and other Pacific Island countries are the most vulnerable to anything that might change the weather. And certainly, if there is to be any rise in sea level, we would see it and we would feel it. And so that's when I thought I would incorporate it into my inaugural statement in 2004, and I did. And of course, nobody else had ever spoken about climate change as in those terms in the past at the General Assembly. And I remember returning home and wondering, have I just made a fool of myself, talking about an issue which is a non-issue? But of course, gladly, by the following year, the Pacific Island leaders started talking about the same thing. And I think it was really focusing attention on such an issue. And I think once I did that, other leaders realized that it is a critical issue for the region. And of course, there is no doubt about it, because most of the Pacific Island countries are on the front line of climate change. Now, after retirement in 2016, I continued to do my work on climate change, talking different parts of the world. And of course, in the process, I think on my own, I'd been thinking, other leaders, former leaders on their own had been thinking, and it was the former president of the Marshall Islands, now back in office, Her Excellency Hilda Heine, who called me up one day and she said, what do you think about setting up a group of elders, former leaders, to talk about, we can't just, walk off the scene. Surely we can continue to make a contribution. And of course, that was the formation of the Pacific Elders Voice. As founding chair, President Heidi started that, and of course, I've taken over, and of course, she's back in office. But I guess no longer part of the Pacific Elders Voice, but maybe the secret
For the
weapon of
moment, for the moment.
yeah, for the moment, but nevertheless, a secret weapon of the Pacific Elders Voice.
I mean, I think it's a wonderful way of an expression of what is culturally very important in the Pacific tradition of elders being
Hmm.
of holding a place of wisdom in society, having lived and had lived experience over many decades. They bring that wisdom to society, and I'm really glad that this is now part of a recognized format that is being utilized by the region as an alternative voice. Because
Hmm.
in political life, obviously, you're restricted sometimes to what you can say. As a
Hmm.
as a Pacific elder, you have a little bit of the the brakes lifted off, perhaps. Has that been your experience?
Well, that's definitely the case. I mean, there are the normal, yes, Prime Minister. I think we've all seen that, and you got to keep in line but sometimes you compromise on what it is that you believe needs to be done because of the niceties of diplomacy and maintaining a good relationship with your neighbors. And of course, it was we when we discussed it initially, we agreed that it would be such a waste of years of experience just to step out of the scene and not continue to make a contribution. And I don't think we've never looked back. I think it's we believe it's gone through the trial process, and I
Mm,
think we are ready to launch as a full-fledged, bringing in new members from different parts of the Pacific Society, both former leaders, political leaders, leaders in academia, leaders in different sectors of life here in the Pacific. But indeed, I think the tradition of having respect for the wisdom of the elder. Hopefully, we hope we can continue to uh, provide that wise guidance to our political
mm.
leaders and to our people.
I mean, I think you were of a generation of Pacific Islanders that really did carry, and I mentioned this in the webinar, a heavy burden of responsibility in the post-independence era. You also educated at University in New Zealand and the UK. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about that journey and how it shaped your view of the world, your career. You were in a unique position as someone, as part of a generation who had to take the reins of administration and the reins of power on at a time where there was very little in terms of precedent, I guess, to be able to build on some of the decisions, some of the work that you did. There's often a fluidity between the bureaucracy and political leadership in the region, unlike, say, Australia, where you'll have very separate tracks of careers. And how important do you think it is for those taking leadership roles in politics and or advocacy to have a strong understanding of how government, trade, international relations, and other things work, particularly when dealing in the context of great power rivalry? There's a couple of questions in there, but I was wondering whether you might be able to reflect on that.
Hmm. Most definitely, I think our experience growing up in a colonial era and our experience with our colonial masters, in many ways it defines our attitude towards our former colonial masters, and trying to have the confidence and the courage to move forward was really a daunting task. In our case, I guess we were very fortunate to have a young leader who was courageous enough to move forward. But I can assure you that the transition from being a colony to become an independent nation is not an easy transition. Mhm. There were people in the country who thought, no, we could never do it on our own. We needed our colonial masters to continue to take us along, to guide us. And it was, I believe, a lonely journey for our early leaders. But in a way, our background of having been educated outside of the country, I think in many ways prepared us to deal with the who were our former colonial masters, because we began to understand the way they think. We could speak the language as good as, if not better, on occasions, and it's no longer that intimidating because there is that complex relationship between our own uh, bureaucrats who are always under the rule of the colonial masters, and the young emerging generation who are who were brought up in a different environment, the same kind of environment that these colonial masters were brought up. And so there was that confidence, there was that lack of fear that they were actually as human as we are, okay, not supernatural human beings. And so that was very useful. And so I think in many ways that has always been a critical period for no doubt all of the Pacific Island countries. And testing, I'm sure there were mistakes made, but in the process over the years we learned our lessons, and hopefully we have refined the process of governance in our own traditional styles.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think going back to that question around the elders or your role as the elders, you are the first generation to have been in that post-independence era who are now
Hmm.
elders and who are
Hmm.
bringing that wisdom of the experience in the post-independence to advice and to, your voice in the mix. I've always been fascinated by Kiribati's ability to manage big relationships in the world. I'm thinking particularly of Ermaya Tabai and earlier leaders navigating the Cold War environment in particular. And, yourself facing the pending issues of climate change and all of the vested interests at play, as you talked a little bit about in your talk today, and emerging geopolitical contests in the region. Was there something about Kiribati's experience during the colonial period and or the great conflicts, say during the Second World War? I mean, the Battle of Tarawa is still known as a very big conflict in World War II at the time. That shaped the way Kiribati leaders approached geopolitics and global affairs, as well as dealing with their own domestic context as well.
Well, most certainly during the Second World War, Kiribati was one of the countries that was not spared by the conflict. We were a venue for one of the most active battles of the war, and of course also our colonial past. I mean, those were interesting because like all colonies, we were also exploited in different ways. And but I think rather fortunately, and I think I say this, the timing of our gaining our independence in 1979 was, uh, I think it was very good timing because with all of the phosphate having been depleted, our value as a colony was no longer there. Okay, phosphate mining was exhausted in 1979 when we also got our independence in 1979. So I guess essentially we are no longer of interest to our former colonial masters. But of course, what didn't happen at the time was the coming into force of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Because I believe had that come into place, I think it would have been a lot more difficult for our former colonial masters to let us go, because here we found new, extremely high value in our huge exclusive economic zone. And so I think that was very fortunate because before that, the prospects for economic viability as a country were very bleak. Okay, we didn't have the resources to carry on, and there was quite some fear by our potential leaders at the time. But with the coming into force of the law of the sea, we began to derive revenue from the licensing of foreign fishing boats, and it's totally new game on the international arena. And in the process, we had some wonderful gains, but we also had some bad experiences. Um, we had the tuna wars, if people might recall, and it has to do with the later with the Cold War conflict, because with the coming into force of the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the United States did not recognize national jurisdiction over the tuna, the highly microfiche species. So we were fighting the Americans on this, and we actually, using a 20-foot skiff, arrested a persona. Okay, it's incredible, but it was true. But it was I think the fact that there was that conflict. We've never fought a war. The only war we ever fought was with the American Tuna Boat Association with respect to tuna. But after that experience, something happened which was very interesting, and I think it defined something of what was happening in different parts, on the other side of the world, which had a bearing and relevance in our part of the world. And this was the licensing of the USSR as a fishing nation in our waters. And I think it changed the opinion of the United States. It had to come in and maybe renegotiate its arrangement with Kiribati. Okay, and of course another part of our former colonial experience as a phosphate as a source of supply for the Australia and New Zealand was that we were able to build up a sovereign funds, our reserve fund, which have now become quite significant. They, on independence, they total something like just over, not quite $70 million. Okay, and this is revenue from the tax, the tax from the sale of phosphate. But now it stands at $1 billion, and so we are perhaps the only, if not one of the very few countries in the world, and certainly in the region, which who have a sizable sovereign funds, and we really are not indebted to any country, and so we have that in relative independence financially. But the reason it happened is because we had very sound financial management in our formative stages under the guidance of our very first leader, the Sayer Metaboy. So he was, by nature, he's a frugal person. So he did that with the national resources, and this is the result. We are the generations that followed have benefited, and hopefully will continue to benefit from that wealth.
It's interesting you say that. I was part of a AusAid funded consultancy looking at trust funds in Kiribati, Tuvalu, and I think Fiji, and Nauru was also included at that stage, but there was a bit we didn't quite get there. But one of the things that struck me during that, this is in 1995, so it's going back a while, but it was as much I felt about culture in Kiribati and the fact that there was a culture of scarcity and scarcity management that really, and it was the same with Tuvalu as well, that where there was this sort of way of managing your resources that actually lent itself into the trust funds and rebuilding those trust funds up and reinvesting in them.
Right.
It was really about, as much a tradition of the region as it was a part of what was, well, I guess the expression of it in the trusts that were being held in escrow. Following from the last question, it would be good to hear your views on climate displacement. How should Australia help in this regard? With the new government, for instance, in Tuvalu signalling an interest in revisiting the Falipili agreement between Australia and Tuvalu announced last year. Do you have any thoughts on this? And, given that this was an opportunity for, people to have freer movement between Australia and Tuvalu, but came with other things attached to it that perhaps were with the new government coming in, questions to be asked. Do you have any thoughts on this and the implications for Kiribati and other low-lying atoll states in the region who may be looking at what happens with this agreement and, if it has implications for them as well?
Well, it's got to be understood that that agreement is at the background of that agreement was the challenge of climate change and the implications of what the future holds for these highly vulnerable countries on the very front line. I've often spoken about how the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, had always reported that in due course, I think initially they estimated that uh, by the end of the century, countries like Kiribati, Tuvalu, and the low-lying atoll island states will no longer be able to accommodate their population. Now that's been forwarded now with the latest report of the IPCC. Now we have until 2060 when our islands are given what is happening with the climate change impacts may be underwater to the point that they will not be habitable. And so, I mean, I understand the emotion of not wanting to be displaced. Nobody wants to be displaced, to lose a home, which is so intrinsic a part of our heritage and life. And it's there's been a lot of objection to the idea of relocation, but I think it's going to come to the point at some point in the future that we may not have a choice unless we can find credible solution alternatives by building up our climate resilience beyond or continue in order to remain above the rising seas and the worsening storms. And so I think it's inevitable in a sense, but whatever happens, even if we are able to raise build our resilience, climate resilience, the ability of our home islands to accommodate a growing population will be considerably reduced to the point that uh, relocation is inevitable, if not for everybody, for some people. And so my concept of that has been that, knowing that this is inevitable, rather than burying our heads in the sand and saying, no, it's not going to happen when we know the science is very clear, I think we should say, okay, if that is the case, then let's do it nicely. Let us not allow it to happen irrationally and chaotically. It must not be chaos. Let's plan it. And I've always advocated the idea of migration with dignity. It's about getting people prepared, qualified, so that if and when they decide to relocate, either to Australia, New Zealand, the United States, or anywhere else in the world, they would be qualified, skilled people, able to live a worthwhile life in whatever society and community they choose to go to. And quite apart from that, I think it is also important that the receiving communities should also be, in a sense, um, trained or acculturated so that they know that what's coming and they know how to deal with it. And so it makes it less painful for all, so that there would be this smooth transition and everybody would benefit by it. Those that come in will be able to get jobs, earn a good living, and not become a not what go to the slum areas of Auckland or Sydney, but be people. And I often joke when I meet our people in different countries. I say, I'd love to see one of you one day become prime minister in this country, which is not an impossibility. After all, everybody is a migrant. And so, I mean, but that idea is not new. What Australia has done with Tuvalu is not a new concept. It exists for the Micronesian countries with the United States. It exists with some of the Melanesian countries with France and Polynesia. It exists with Polynesian countries with New Zealand. And there are those few of us who really have no relationship. Most of us in that category would have been former British colonies, because the British colony government went. It's on the other side of the world. And so if there is to be a similar arrangement between Tuvalu and Australia, I think it's just not too different from what already exists. I know that quite recently, I think the Micronesian countries have just concluded the negotiation of the Compact of Free Association. And so similar thing, they've worked in the past with other countries. There's no reason why they shouldn't work. I think there are some things to be smoothed out, and I accept that. But I think the concept, I believe, is sound, and it may be the only way to deal with this. I don't know. I think there's been some discussion of this in the past. I think there was a suggestion that maybe we form something like a European Union type arrangement where there is free movement, where there is a sharing of markets and what have you. But I think for the governments to say no, we don't want it, I think we need to let the people decide. Because I'm of the view that if you want to go, that's your choice, and government shouldn't stop you from going if that is your choice. And so, being given the opportunity to do that, I think it's a wonderful way of integrating each other. I mean, after all, we consider ourselves to be a family of the Pacific Island nations, including Australia and New Zealand. Let's be a family of nations.
In that context, I guess this leans itself into again the next question. Apart from climate change, what are the emerging challenges that you see face the Pacific at this time? Obviously, there's a lot of talk of the issue of deep sea mining, for instance, as a contentious issue. Uh, the fishing rights continues to be something of contestation between, what was a tradition that was in the Pacific with the FFA previously, but now PINA and others being part of the equation of the Pacific. I guess for you as an elder statesman now, looking at the Pacific and looking at the challenges, one, what are they? And two, if there was a thing that you felt was the one or the two or three things that should be really important for the region to take forward or be thinking about, what would they be?
Well, I think apart, of course, from the climate change, which I believe, and I think this is true for the Pacific Island countries, is the primary source of threat in terms of security. But I think there is no question that there is now a very active tug of war, strategic tug of war between the superpowers to gain dominance. And as they get into greater conflict, they will pull in the different countries. The Pacific seems to have taken prominence as an area where there will be a tug of war. I think we know what's happening with China and the United States, Australia trying, and I think the speculation and the suggestion that the agreement between Tuvalu and Australia might have been motivated in some way by that tug of war, strategic tug of war. And so the countries will find themselves being poached, being part of them. And that's going to be a problem. It's already a problem. But not only that, but it brings in a new dimension into our political system in the Pacific. Most, if not all, of our Pacific Island countries are so-called democracies. But the gradual moving in of China as an authoritarian country is going to bring about changes which would be new in our part of the world. I think I would be correct in saying also that there is a growing authoritarianism in the region. Okay, I mean Fiji with the coups. I think there is now a culture of our leaders not wanting to lose and undermining the democratic process in doing so. I think, for example, I think what happened in Samoa during after the last election was a very interesting event where the former leader just would not relinquish leadership. Okay, that was an interesting move. How that happened and what motivated it was interesting, but I think it came about because they didn't. The incumbent didn't just wanted to ignore the electoral results and just wanted to maintain control. We have our own problems in Kiribati with the sacking of our judiciary, Court of Appeal judges and High Court, Chief Justice of the High Court. Those are things that are new, and I think they indicate that there is that in growing culture of just not ignoring what are the norms, even the constitution, the laws that we have in place, and it's going to become normal because once you cross that red line, it becomes so much easier to do it again, and I'm sure other countries in the region are watching what's been going on and they simply say it's doable. Kiribati has just done it, so we sacked our judiciary, and so this, I believe, is a growing trend. It's also, of course, it's happening in different parts of the world, even in the United States. So maybe it's a global trend. I don't know. And of course, the what's happening with the geopolitical uh, tug of war, it it tends to indicate that there is a new form of colonization. Okay, and it's a scramble for resources and strategic placement. For example, China doesn't really have a place in the region, but it's beginning to do that. Kiribati is very important because it spreads from the west to the east, right up close to the U.S. border, and that is significant because China, with the U.S. strategy of containing China in Korea, Japan, and Guam, and of course now in other Asian countries, China feels somewhat claustrophobic, and it would be, I'm sure, they would love to have a base somewhere very close to the United States, so that you're doing it to us, we can also do it to you, and so that brings new tensions, which is not healthy in our part of the world. And I do believe that as a region, the Pacific countries on their own need to take greater control of their political, strategic, and political significance.
That's why you are one of our eminent elders, Anote. I have one final question I ask all my guests. If there were three pieces of advice you would give your younger self, given what you know,
Mhm.
what would they be?
Well, I think the advice to myself, I think I would also like to hope that it's advice to our young generation. And I think what is important is to be proactive. Don't ever make the mistake of standing by on the sidelines while things are being determined which affect you, yourself, your nation, your region. Be in the thick of it. And I think climate change taught us that because a lot of things happened that in which we did not take active part until too late. I think, for one example, that we didn't participate in the negotiations on the law of the sea. We lost out as a result in in the definition of the archipelagic state. Okay, we were not there, and the British who were looking after us did not find it in their interest to be there on our behalf. And so, don't stand on the sideline because you are important, you are relevant, and nobody is going to make you relevant. You just got to do it yourself. So, in terms of international engagement, we need to be very proactive and never underestimate our relevance. I think on the issue of climate change, I think we have something that I would have liked being able to conclude my terms in office with would have been to be able to come up with a credible solution for the challenge of climate change. What happens, because it is a practical challenge, what is to happen to my grandchildren? Okay, while the waters are rising, while the land is being submerged, what is to happen to my grandchildren? I don't have an answer for that, and I think we need to be able to find an answer. And there's no doubt in my mind there is an answer, but we just haven't identified it yet. And so I would continue not so much to just focus on cutting emissions, but also finding solutions to the practical problem of accommodating our people in the next 20, 30 years, because there is going to be a problem. And it's about building our resilience. Okay? How do we build our resilience? What is to be our future? But I think in some of the statements that I've made, I absolutely believe that in 20, 30, 40 years' time, this world will not be what it is today. It's going to be a different world. And there's got to be a new way at looking at things in the world, because the current arrangements do not fit it. Just like the United Nations, it's not able to deal with climate change. And so those are the things that I'd like to think that we can think ahead a little bit and see that unless we can address these things, they could become huge, if not insurmountable problems in the future.
So, being active, thinking ahead, is there a last piece of advice you'd give yourself?
Indeed, I mean, I think we've got to believe in ourselves. I think we must never think that we are less than what we are.
That's a fantastic way to think. And particularly given your role, Anote, as a Pacific statesman, as an elder, and as someone that has huge respect from all of us. Thank you for taking the time. It's been a real pleasure hosting you here at the centre, and good luck with the rest of the week and other things that you're doing here in Australia.
Thank you, Alopi, for hosting me, and God bless you.
You too. Thank you for listening to this episode of A JustER Generation. It's through supporters like yourself that we keep our work going. You can support the work of the Edmund Rice Centre for Justice and Community Education by making a donation through our website, www.erc.org.au. The Edmund Rice Centre for Justice and Community Education is part of Edmund Rice Community Services. I'm Alopi Latukefu. Until next time, goodbye.